Lesson number 53 and first video of the registration form and login form series. We are learning JavaScript and we are learning JavaScript by examples. Login and registration forms, such as the one visible in front of you, are far too common nowadays, and the chances are, if you are a web developer, the chances are that you will have to create a similar form in your career very many times. This is another example. And to create this form, you do not need to learn JavaScript at all. But there are a few funky things that you can do. For example, on this website, when you click in an input field, the placeholder jumps up. And then when you come out, it jumps back down. And also when you type in something here, the password is hidden, but you can click on this link here to show the password. So to do this, you will have to know a little bit of JavaScript. So we will create a form similar to this one. So I have my text editor, Sublime text editor, and the browser side by side, so we can see what we're doing. So this is the browser that will show us the code, that will show us the result of the code that we are writing. So first thing first, I will say file, new file, and I will save this file as I will say login.html, and I will save it and I'll refresh the page. This is what it looks like right now. Okay, so I will say HTML, and we now have a basic HTML structure with a few elements. Anything between head, closing and opening head tags is for the machine processing, for metadata, and the body is where you show your magic, you write your code, your HTML code. And we've been using the same page for our CSS, for styling of the web page. And this is a very good opportunity for you to understand the importance of CSS. So first lesson is mainly CSS, and at the end of the lesson I will show you how important it is to understand the CSS. So the body element is already there, and if I refresh it, nothing is visible, but the body element is already there, and I can show you how it looks like. So I will say style, and opening and closing style tag. This is where we write our CSS, and I will target our body element, which is this one, and I will say border 1 pixel solid black. So if I save it and I refresh it, this is what the body looks like. And whatever you do afterwards, the size of the body will increase. Okay, first of all, we will increase the height of our body. So I will say height and 90 VH, viewport height, 90% of the viewport height. We want this body to increase in size vertically to have a vertical height of 90% of the viewable height of the browser. Save it, refresh it. Now this is our body now, which is 90% of the viewport of the browser. And I will now create our first element, which is a div, which is like an invisible container, and I will say form, and within form I will create a label. Now input is the first element that I have created in this on this page, which is visible by default. So if I save it and if I refresh it, we have an input field here. Default type is text. What it means that you can type in numbers and you can type in characters in this input field, but you can also specifically mention that this is a text type. And I will also use a placeholder, and I will say name. So if I save it and if I refresh it, we have our placeholder, and you can see that there is some margin, and we want to control everything 100%. So I will get rid of this default margin, and also the padding that is by default present there. So I will use something that is known as universal selector star, and this will select everything and will affect everything on the web page unless you specifically target those elements. If you don't, the elements will take these properties. Okay, so I will say margin and I will say 0. If I save it and if I maximize it, you'll notice when I refresh it, you'll notice that default margin will be gone. So if I refresh it, there is no default margin now. So I will also say padding 0. If I save it, notice the vertical height of the input field, it will go a bit smaller. Okay, if I refresh it, it has gone a bit smaller. And I will also say box sizing, and I will say border box. What it means that whatever box we are creating, the size of it will not be affected by the margin and padding of the elements that we use in this style sheet. So if I save it and if I refresh it, nothing happens, but there is a lot has happened in the background, and I'll show you what has happened. Okay, I will also create another element that is a span element, and I will say name. If I save it and refresh it, that's our span element, and this is the text that is between this these two opening and closing span elements. We want to display this input field and this span element in the middle of the page as it was visible in our example. So I will have to come back to my style area and I will target body, and I will say place content, and I will say center. If I save it, nothing should happen because I have to specify, I have to say display, and I will say grid. So if I save it now and refresh it, that everything within this body tag is exactly in the middle of the page. Now, since we now understand what our body is, I don't have to have this outline, this border, and I will comment this out and I will save it and I refresh it. We know that the height of the body is 90% of the visible height of the browser, the viewport. So I will target the form element next, and I will say form, an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, and I will provide it a border of 1 pixel solid black. Okay, and I will save it, and we now have a border around these elements. I will also say padding 3 VW. Okay, so 3% of the viewport width. If I save it and if I refresh it, we now have a padding that is of padding which is 3% of the viewport. What it means that if I increase the size of the browser, maybe this is good enough for a small screen, but when I come onto the bigger screen, the width, the padding is increasing. As you can see, the padding is increasing and decreasing. What it means that our page is responsive for all the devices that may be available. I will also increase the width of this form a little bit bigger, and I will say width, and I will say 90% of the viewport. Okay, if I save it and if I refresh it, we have a form element that is taking 90% of the width of the web browser, and if I increase it, the width increases with the page. If I go onto the bigger screen such as my laptop, the form becomes bigger. But on the bigger screen, on the smaller screens, this looks perfect. Maybe on a mobile phone this looks perfect, or on a tablet, but when I go on a bigger screen this looks a bit odd. So I want to limit the size, the width of the element to a certain pixels, and I will say max width, and I will hard code it 768 pixels. What it means that on the smaller screens the width is 90% of the viewport, but when you go bigger the size will never increase more than 760 pixels on the web page. Okay, next I want to say border radius colon, and I will say 8 pixels. So if I save it and if I maximize it, the border radius, you notice that the edges of this border are very sharp, and by giving border radius, if I refresh it, that's how I want them to be. Okay, so it's a bit curved, it's a bit better. So I'll change the size of my browser one more time. Next thing that I want to target is not the next element, but I want to target this element. Okay, so I will, within my style area, I will say input, an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, and the first thing that I want to do is to increase the width of this input field to 100%. So I will say width 100%. I'm trying to increase the width of this input element to 100% of the parent, or in this case grandparent element, excluding this padding of 3%. So if I save it and if I refresh it, the length of the input field is 100% of the parent or grandparent element, and the span element is visible below the input field. Something that looks very ugly is this outline, is this border around the input field, and I will say border none. So if I save it, we do not have any border, but you can still type into it. One thing that is still frustrating me is that when I click into this input field, the border comes back, and we can also fix that. I will say outline none. If I save it and if I refresh it, we now have an input field. You can click into it, you can type in it, but it does not have any outline or border, which looks perfect. Now that we have created our first input element and our first span element, we can simply copy these, and I can paste this to create a second element, and this time I will change the type to email. Okay, and I will change the placeholder to email as well, and I will also change this visible text here to email. So if I save it and if I refresh it, now this type email is useful for validating the email address. So what it means that when a user types in something, it will look for this @ symbol, and it will also check where there's a .com or .org or something like that. Okay, so it will ensure that this email address is a valid email address, not with the help of not currently, but when we are validating the form, this type email is useful. We can also create another element, another set of these elements, and I will copy and paste it, and I will change the type to password, and I will change the placeholder to password as well, and I will change this text to password as well. So the type password, the input type password, make sure that when you type in a password, your password is hidden. If I change it back to text, you should be able to see it. Okay, So this is how our form looks like now. We want to separate these elements, so I want to create a line here, a horizontal line, and we can easily do that. And for that I will target this label element, every label element in on this page. I will have to target it, so I'll have to go back to my style area. I will say label and an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, and I will say border bottom 1 pixel solid black, 1 pixel solid black. If I save it and if I refresh it, that's how it currently looks like, which is not ideal. Okay, so which I just want one line here, and we'll fix that in a minute. But I also want to provide a margin of a few pixels, so I will say margin bottom, and I will say 15 pixels. Okay, so if I save it, nothing should happen. Okay, so the reason being is that in the form area I will have to say display flex, and if I save it now and refresh it, that's how it looks like, and this is not what we want either. So I will say flex direction column. So if I save it now, maximize it and refresh it, that's how our form looks like, and we're getting there. So there is a gap of 15 pixels between the elements, and we are getting close to what we are seeing on the forms that we have seen initially. So the next thing that I want to do, I want to increase the size of this text here, and I will go to our body element, and I will say font size 22 pixels should be more than enough. This is hard coded. So refresh it. We now have our form that looks a bit better now. So I will also create a button below this field, this input field, and this span, and I will go back to my HTML area body, and below the last label element I will say button, and I will say registration. If I save it and if I refresh it, we have a button, and we can target this button as well to make it look a bit more beautiful. So I will go back to my style area, and I will target all the buttons on this page. Button, and then an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket. First thing that I want to target is the height, and I will say maybe 40 pixels. If I save it and refresh it, the height of the button is 40 pixels. I will give it a border radius of 8 pixels, similar to the one that is there. And if I save it, maximize it and refresh it, the button has a border radius of 8 pixels. I will change the size of this writing here, and I will say font size 20 pixels maybe. Save it and refresh it, and that's how it looks like. Background color is the next, and I will say steel blue. If I save it, our button has a steel blue color. This looks a bit odd, so I will say color, and I'll say white. And if I save it and if I refresh it, we have a button with white writing and a steel blue background color. Looks a bit more beautiful and professional. I want to increase the gap between this field and this field. So I will say margin top 15 pixels, save it and refresh it. We now have a decent gap. There is an outline which looks a bit ugly and I want to get rid of it, and I will say border none. And if I save it and refresh it, we have a button that looks a tiny bit better. I also want to create a shadow behind this form. Okay, so I'll go to the form area and I will say box shadow. Okay, 5 pixels, a box shadow 5 pixels on the right hand side, and then another 5 pixels at the bottom, and then gray color maybe. Okay, so if I save it and if I refresh it, we have a border, we have a box shadow which gives it a 3D look and a bit more, looks a bit more professional. So if I change the size of my browser one more time, I can also type in a third number here to give it some blurriness. Okay, so 5 pixels for example. If I save it and if I refresh it, we have the shadow that is a bit blurred. Okay, so I will say maybe 10 pixels here, 10 pixels here, and maybe 15 pixels here with the gray color. And if I save it and if I refresh it, that is how it looks like. We can actually increase this a bit more. Okay, so 15 pixels, and then maybe 25 pixels here. If I save it and refresh it, the sum of the shadow is visible here, which makes it look very professional and very beautiful. And we can apply the same thing behind this button. So I can simply copy this property and then paste it into the button. Okay, so if I save it and refresh it, our button is also looking a bit better, although this is a bit too much, so I'll change the parameters. So maybe 10 pixels, 10 pixels and 15 pixels. If I save it and refresh it, this is a tiny bit better now. I will also get rid of this outline, and to do that I will go to my form and I will simply comment this out. I'll leave it there for your reference. I'll copy the code onto the website so you can download it and practice it. So if I save it and refresh it now, we have a beautiful looking, professional looking form, and you can type into it. And for the rest of the JavaScript, we will probably have to do another session. So just wanted to show you the importance of CSS as I promised. So if I change the size of my browser one more time, and if I comment every CSS style, and if I save it and if I refresh it, this is our form without CSS styling, which looks very ugly and very basic. So if I change the size of my browser one more time and reactivate this styling, and if I save it and refresh it, that's how the form looks like with the help of CSS. So hope you understand what is the importance of CSS and what is how important it is for us to produce professional looking web pages. So that's all for now. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lesson.